While camping, my son said, "Hope the bears finish you off." He didn't expect that I was. The air in the Sequoia National Park was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside our tent. David zipped up the sleeping bag, the synthetic material rasping like a judgment. Outside, the last sliver of sunset painted the giant sequoias in hues of orange and purple, but inside, it was already night. "Are you sure you packed the extra batteries for the lantern, Dad?" Ethan's voice was flat, devoid of the usual teenage inflection, which somehow made it sound even more accusatory. He was hunched over his phone, the screen a tiny, defiant beacon in the growing gloom. David sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Yes, Ethan, I checked the list twice. Everything is where it should be." He tried to keep his voice even, but the weariness was a heavy cloak. This trip, meant to be a bridge, felt more like a chasm widening between them. Ethan grunted, not looking up. "Right, just like everything else is where it should be." The sarcasm was a thinly veiled jab, a familiar weapon in their recent skirmishes. David felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just about batteries. It was about the divorce, about his new job that took him away more often, about the unspoken accusation that he wasn't enough, hadn't been enough, for a long time. He'd suggested this camping trip, just the two of them, hoping the wilderness would strip away the layers of resentment, force them to reconnect. Instead, it felt like the vast, silent trees were amplifying their discord. "What's that supposed to mean, Ethan?" David asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes, usually a warm hazel like his mother's, were cold and distant. "It means you always say things are fine, Dad, that everything's under control. But it never is it? Mom's gone, you're never home, and now we're stuck out here in the middle of nowhere because you think a few nights in a tent will magically fix everything." He gestured wildly around the small tent, as if it were a prison. David flinched. "That's not fair. I'm trying, Ethan. This is me trying." "Trying what? To prove you're still the adventure dad?" Ethan scoffed, a bitter sound. "You haven't been on a real camping trip in years. You're just playing at it, like you play at everything else." The words struck David like physical blows. He remembered the old days before the corporate climb, before the endless meetings and the slow erosion of his marriage. He used to take Ethan on weekend hikes, teach him about constellations, identify bird calls. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago, belonging to a different man. "I'm not playing, Ethan," David said, his voice low, strained. "I wanted this. I thought we could talk, remember what it was like." "What it was like?" Ethan's voice rose, cracking with a raw emotion that finally broke through his detached facade. "What it was like was you always promising things, always saying, 'next time,' and then soon never came. And now Mom's with Mark and you're here, trying to pretend like nothing happened." The mention of Mark, his ex-wife's new partner, was a deliberate, painful twist of the knife. David closed his eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. He felt a surge of anger, hot and quick, but he pushed it down. He couldn't lose his temper. Not now, not here. "Ethan, that's enough," David said, his voice tight. "We're not going to talk about your mother and Mark. This is about us." "There is no us," Ethan yelled, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. He threw his phone onto his sleeping bag, the plastic clattering against the fabric. "You just don't get it, do you? You're so busy trying to be this perfect, strong guy, you don't even see what's real anymore." David stood up, his head almost touching the tent ceiling. He felt a tremor in his hands. "I see you, Ethan. I see you hurting, and I'm hurting too. This isn't easy for any of us." "Oh, poor Dad," Ethan sneered, his face contorted in a mask of adolescent fury. "Always the victim, right? Always the one who tried his best. You know what? I wish we hadn't come. I wish I was anywhere but here. I wish—" He paused, his chest heaving, searching for the most venomous words. His eyes, wide and blazing, locked onto David's. "I wish the bears would finish you off." The words hung in the air, sharp and brutal, slicing through the thin membrane of their strained peace. David felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The world seemed to tilt, the scent of pine suddenly acrid, the distant hoot of an owl sounding like a mournful cry. He stared at Ethan, who, for a split second, looked shocked by his own outburst, a flicker of fear in his eyes quickly replaced by defiance. David couldn't speak. The pain was too raw, too deep. His own son, wishing him dead. He turned away, fumbling with the zipper of the tent flap, needing air, needing space, needing to escape the suffocating weight of those words. He pushed through the flap and stepped out into the twilight, the cold mountain air a welcome shock against his burning face. He walked a few paces from the tent, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The sequoias loomed, ancient sentinels, their massive trunks disappearing into the darkening sky. He leaned against one, the rough bark digging into his back, grounding him. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, to push back the wave of despair that threatened to engulf him. He'd faced down angry clients, navigated treacherous mergers, even survived a near-fatal car accident years ago, but nothing had ever hurt as much as those words from his son. "Hope the bears finish you off." He opened his eyes, scanning the familiar campsite, the small fire pit, the cooler, the two folding chairs, all symbols of a failed attempt at normalcy. He knew he couldn't just walk away. He was the adult. He was the father. He had to fix this. But how? A sudden rustle in the undergrowth nearby made him freeze. It wasn't the gentle whisper of the wind or the scamper of a squirrel. This was heavier, more deliberate. David's senses, honed by years of something he rarely spoke about, immediately went on high alert. He'd spent enough time in the wild, in different capacities, to recognize the subtle shift in the forest symphony when something large, something predatory, was moving. He strained his ears, listening. The hooting owl had gone silent. The chirping crickets had ceased their chorus. An unnatural stillness had fallen over the woods, a quiet that spoke of a presence. He slowly pushed himself off the tree, his eyes sweeping the perimeter of their small clearing. The shadows were deepening, making it hard to distinguish shapes. He reached for the heavy-duty flashlight clipped to his belt, his fingers finding the familiar cold metal. Another rustle, closer this time, accompanied by a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking under significant weight. It was coming from the direction of the food storage locker, a metal box bolted to a tree, designed to be bear-proof. David's heart began to pound, a different kind of fear now, cold and sharp. Not the emotional pain from Ethan's words, but the primal, instinctual fear of danger. He knew the park had a healthy black bear population. They were usually shy, easily deterred, but a hungry bear, especially one accustomed to human food, could be bold, unpredictable. He took a cautious step forward, his gaze fixed on the dense line of trees. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He had to check the food locker. If a bear got into their supplies, it wouldn't just be a nuisance. It would be a serious problem. And Ethan was still in the tent, oblivious, probably still fuming. He took another step, then another, moving silently, his old training kicking in. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready to react. He remembered the countless hours spent in the wilderness, not as a casual camper, but as someone who understood its raw, unforgiving nature. He remembered the lessons learned, sometimes painfully, about respect, caution, and the thin line between observer and prey. A low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled from the shadows. It was unmistakable. A bear, and it sounded close. David gripped the flashlight, his knuckles white. He knew what he had to do. He had to scare it away, but he also knew that a cornered or habituated bear could be incredibly dangerous. He had to be smart. He had to be quick. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine now mixed with something else, something wild and musky. He could feel the bear's presence, a heavy, powerful energy in the air. He heard a faint movement from the tent. Ethan. He couldn't let Ethan come out. Not yet. He raised the flashlight, his thumb hovering over the switch. He had to make himself look big, make a lot of noise, but he also had to assess the situation first. Was it a cub? A sow with cubs? A lone male? Each scenario demanded a different approach. He took one more step, peering into the gloom, and then he saw it. Two eyes, reflecting the faint ambient light, glowing like embers in the darkness, large, dark, and utterly devoid of fear. The silhouette of a massive head, followed by the hulking mass of its body, slowly emerging from the trees. It was a large black bear, bigger than any he'd seen in this park before, and it was heading straight for their food. David's mind raced, calculating distances, assessing threats. He knew the protocols, the safety measures, but theory was one thing. Facing a creature of this size, in the fading light, with his son just feet away, was another entirely. He had to act. Now, before it reached the food, before Ethan stumbled out of the tent, he took a deep, steadying breath, pushing aside the lingering sting of his son's words. All that mattered now was protection. All that mattered was survival. He was no longer just a father trying to reconnect. He was something else, something Ethan had no idea about. He clicked on the flashlight, aiming the powerful beam directly at the bear's eyes. The sudden burst of light momentarily startled the animal, making it pause, its head cocked. "Hey, get out of here!" David roared, his voice echoing through the silent forest, a primal sound that surprised even himself. He clapped his hands together, making as much noise as possible, trying to appear as large and threatening as he could. The bear grunted, a low warning sound, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the forest floor. It was testing him. David knew this wasn't a typical easily scared bear. This one was bold, and it was hungry. He heard the tent flap rustle again, then Ethan's voice, muffled and confused. "Dad, what's going on out there?" David's blood ran cold. Ethan was coming out. He had to stop him. He had to deal with this. Alone, he took another step towards the bear, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Stay in the tent, Ethan, now!" he yelled, his voice strained, not taking his eyes off the bear. The bear let out another louder growl, a clear challenge. It lowered its head slightly, a sign of aggression. It was ready to stand its ground. David knew he was in a precarious situation. He had to deter the bear without provoking a full-blown attack. He had to make it understand that this was not an easy meal, and he had to do it before Ethan saw what was happening, before his son's hurtful words became a horrifying reality. He took another deep breath, his mind clearing, focusing solely on the task at hand. The years of suppressed instincts, of specialized knowledge, began to resurface. He wasn't just David, the divorced dad, trying to mend fences. He was something more, something he'd buried deep, something he'd hoped he'd never have to be again. He shifted his weight, his stance subtly changing, his body language communicating a different message to the animal, a message of readiness, of unwavering resolve. He was no longer just shouting, he was preparing. The bear took another step, its eyes fixed on him. It was a standoff, and David knew, with chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. The night was long, and the wilderness had a way of revealing truths, whether you were ready for them or not. And his son, just feet away, was about to witness a side of his father he never knew existed. The bear let out another guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through David's chest, a primal warning. It took another heavy step, its massive head swaying slightly, testing the air. Its eyes, still reflecting the flashlight beam, held a glint of predatory intelligence. This wasn't just a curious animal. It was an animal that had learned to associate humans with food, and it wasn't easily intimidated. "Dad, what's happening?" Ethan's voice, laced with a tremor of genuine fear, cut through the tense silence from inside the tent. "Stay inside, Ethan, don't come out," David commanded, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. He kept his eyes locked on the bear, his body coiled, ready. He knew that turning his back even for a second could be a fatal mistake. The bear took another slow, deliberate step, its nose twitching, clearly picking up the scent of the food locker. It was closing the distance. David knew he had to escalate. Standard bear safety protocols, making noise, appearing large, were clearly not enough for this particular animal. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the small cylindrical canister of bear spray. It was a last resort, a powerful deterrent, but one that needed to be used correctly and at the right moment. Too soon, and it might not be effective. Too late, and he could be in serious trouble. He pulled out the canister, holding it ready. "Listen to me, bear," David said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but filled with an authority that surprised even himself. He wasn't just talking to the animal, he was talking to himself, reminding himself of the training, the discipline. "This isn't your territory tonight, not here. Not with my son." The bear paused, perhaps sensing the shift in David's demeanor, the subtle change in his energy. It let out a huff, a puff of warm air visible in the cool night. It was still assessing him, weighing its options. David knew this was a critical moment. He couldn't show fear, couldn't show hesitation. He had to project absolute dominance, a refusal to yield. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, pine-scented air. Then, with a sudden explosive movement, David stomped his foot hard on the ground, letting out a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the night. It wasn't a human whistle. It was a sound he'd learned years ago, a high-frequency shriek designed to mimic the alarm call of certain prey animals, a sound that often startled predators. The bear flinched, taking a quick step back, its ears flattening slightly. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. It had broken its forward momentum. "That's right," David muttered, keeping his voice steady. "Go on, find your own dinner." He slowly raised his arms, making himself appear even larger, and took a step forward, maintaining eye contact. He was pushing the boundary, asserting his presence. The bear watched him, its head still lowered, but the aggressive posture seemed to soften, replaced by a wary caution. From the tent, Ethan's voice came again, louder this time, tinged with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Dad, what was that sound? What are you doing?" David ignored him, his focus entirely on the bear. He knew he had to get it to retreat, and quickly. He couldn't afford to have Ethan distracted, or worse, try to intervene. He took another step, then another, slowly advancing on the bear. The animal, after a moment of tense deliberation, finally turned its massive body, lumbering slowly back towards the tree line. It paused at the edge of the clearing, casting one last lingering glance at David before disappearing into the dense shadows. David didn't relax immediately. He stood there for another full minute, listening, scanning the darkness, making sure the threat was truly gone. Only when the forest's natural sounds began to return, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, did he finally lower his arms and let out a long, shaky breath. His heart was still pounding, a frantic drum against his ribs, but the adrenaline that had surged through him was slowly receding, leaving him feeling strangely hollow. He hadn't had to use the bear spray, a small mercy. He turned towards the tent, the flashlight beams sweeping across the canvas. The flap was unzipped, and Ethan was peering out, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else David couldn't quite decipher. "Dad? What just happened?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. David walked slowly back to the tent, his legs feeling a little wobbly. He knelt down, looking at his son. "It was a bear, Ethan. A big one. It was trying to get into the food locker." Ethan stared at him, his gaze intense. "A bear? But you made that sound, and you walked towards it. You weren't scared?" David managed a weak smile. "Of course I was scared, son. Anyone would be, but I knew what to do." He tried to sound nonchalant, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Ethan didn't look convinced. "That wasn't just knowing what to do, Dad. That was different. You were like a different person." He paused, then added, "And that sound? What was that sound?" David hesitated. This was it, the moment of truth, or at least the beginning of it. He couldn't just brush it off. Ethan had seen something, felt something. His son, who had just wished him dead, was now looking at him with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Come out, Ethan," David said, his voice softer now. "Let's sit by the fire. We need to talk." Ethan slowly emerged from the tent, his movements stiff. He looked around the clearing as if expecting the bear to reappear at any moment. He sat down on one of the folding chairs, still clutching his phone, though he wasn't looking at it. David started a small fire in the pit, the flames crackling to life, casting dancing shadows on their faces. The warmth was a welcome comfort against the chill of the night. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. How much could he tell Ethan? How much should he tell him? "Ethan," David began, choosing his words carefully. "What you saw tonight, it's not something most people experience, and it's not something I usually talk about." Ethan looked up, his eyes fixed on David. "What is it, Dad? Are you some kind of bear whisperer?" He tried for a joke, but his voice cracked. David chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Not exactly. But I have a particular set of skills I learned a long time ago in a different life." He watched Ethan's face, seeing the gears turning, the questions forming. "Before you were born, before I met your mum, I spent some time working in environments where understanding wildlife, especially large predators, was crucial. It was part of a specialized unit. We were trained in observation, tracking, and when absolutely necessary, deterrence, non-lethal deterrence." Ethan's jaw dropped slightly. "A specialized unit? Like military? Or something else?" David nodded slowly. "Something else. It was a government agency, focused on environmental protection, but in a very hands-on way. We operated in remote areas, often dealing with situations where human and wildlife conflict was high. My job was to understand the animals, predict their behavior, and find ways to mitigate risks without harming them." He paused, remembering the vast, untamed landscapes, the silent vigilance, the constant tension. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different person entirely. He'd buried that part of himself when he'd met Sarah, when he'd decided to settle down, to build a normal life, a family. He'd traded the wilderness for a corner office, the thrill of the chase for the stability of a steady paycheck. "That sound I made," David continued, "it's a specific frequency, designed to startle. It's not something you learn in a weekend camping course. And walking towards a bear, that's about reading its body language, understanding its intent, and projecting confidence. It's about making it believe you're more trouble than a meal." Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire, processing this unexpected revelation. The anger and resentment that had clouded his face earlier had been replaced by a profound curiosity. "So, you were like a wildlife agent?" Ethan finally asked, the words sounding strange, almost fantastical coming from his mouth. "Something like that," David confirmed. "It was a long time ago. I left that life behind. It was demanding, dangerous. I wanted something different. I wanted a family. He looked at Ethan, a flicker of pain in his eyes. I wanted to be a good father, a present father. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, a reminder of their earlier fight. David knew he couldn't ignore it. I know I haven't always been that, Ethan, David said, his voice raw with regret. The job, the divorce, it's been hard. I've made mistakes. I've been distracted. But everything I've done, every choice I've made, has always been with you in mind. To provide for you, to protect you. Ethan looked away, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. I didn't know any of that, Dad. You never told me. I know, David admitted. It was a part of my past I thought was best left buried. It wasn't relevant to the life I was building. I wanted to be normal. For you, for your mom, he sighed. But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you. He gestured towards the dark woods. Like tonight, that bear. It wasn't just a random encounter. It was a test, and it reminded me that some things once learned never truly leave you. Ethan finally met his gaze, his eyes still wide, but now with a dawning understanding. So, you're saying you're secretly a badass? A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. David couldn't help but smile back, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Something like that, son. Something like that. The tension between them, though not entirely gone, had shifted. The raw wound of Ethan's words still throbbed, but a new thread had been woven into the fabric of their relationship, a thread of shared secret, of unexpected depth. But why did you leave? Ethan pressed. His curiosity piqued. If you were so good at it, and it sounds exciting. David's smile faded. It was exciting, yes, but it also came with a cost, a heavy one. There were things I saw, things I had to do, things that change a person. I didn't want that for my family. I wanted peace, stability. He paused, looking into the flickering flames. And sometimes, even with the best intentions, you realize you can't outrun who you truly are. He looked at Ethan, his expression serious. What happened tonight, Ethan, with the bear? It's not something you tell people. It's not a story for school or your friends. This is our secret, okay? Ethan nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes. Okay, Dad, our secret. He looked around the dark woods again, but this time the fear seemed to have lessened, replaced by a sense of wonder and perhaps a flicker of pride. So, what else can you do? David chuckled softly. Well, for starters, I can make sure we don't have any more unwelcome visitors tonight, and tomorrow we're going to review all the bear safety protocols, properly, and then maybe we can actually talk about what's really going on with us. He saw a flicker of something in Ethan's eyes, not just curiosity, but a hint of vulnerability, a willingness to engage. The wall between them hadn't crumbled entirely, but a small crack had appeared, letting in a sliver of light. As the fire crackled, casting long dancing shadows, David knew this was just the beginning. The bear encounter had forced his hand, revealing a part of himself he'd kept hidden for decades. And now the real challenge began, navigating the aftermath of that revelation and figuring out if this unexpected truth could truly heal the rift with his son, or if it would simply complicate things further. The wilderness had a way of stripping away pretenses, and tonight it had stripped away one of his biggest. He was no longer just the distant, divorced dad. He was something more, and Ethan was finally beginning to see it. The morning after the bear encounter dawned with a crisp, clear sky, the air still cool but promising warmth. Sunlight filtered through the towering sequoias, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. The scent of pine was stronger now, mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the dying embers of their fire. David had spent most of the night awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, his senses on high alert, but also replaying the conversation with Ethan. The raw anger from his son had been replaced by a fragile curiosity, a tentative bridge forming where a chasm had been. Ethan was still asleep in the tent when David started brewing coffee on their portable stove. He watched the steam rise, a small, comforting ritual. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The bear incident had been terrifying, but it had also been a catalyst, forcing him to confront not just an external threat, but the internal one that had been festering between him and his son. When Ethan finally emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he looked less guarded than he had in days. He still had that teenage slouch, but his shoulders seemed a little less hunched, his gaze less defiant. "Morning," Ethan mumbled, stretching. He glanced towards the food locker, then back at David. "No more visitors?" David shook his head. "All clear. I kept an eye out, and I reinforced the food storage. No bears getting in there without a crowbar." He offered Ethan a cup of hot chocolate. Ethan took it, his fingers wrapping around the warm mug. He sat down by the fire pit, staring into the embers. The silence stretched, not awkward this time, but contemplative. "So," Ethan began, his voice low. This specialized unit. What exactly did you do? David took a sip of his coffee. We were called Wildlife Response and Mitigation Specialists. It was a mouthful, so we just called ourselves rangers or trackers, depending on the mission. Our primary goal was to prevent human-wildlife conflict, especially in remote areas or during natural disasters where animal habitats were disrupted. We'd track large predators, relocate them if necessary, and sometimes educate local populations on coexistence. Like catching bears? Ethan asked, his eyes wide. Sometimes. Or wolves? Or mountain lions? Whatever the local ecosystem required. It wasn't about hunting or harming them. It was about understanding their behavior, their patterns, and finding ways to keep both humans and animals safe. It involved a lot of tracking, observation, and sometimes very delicate interventions. And that sound you made last night, that's a specific vocalization. It's not just a random whistle. It's designed to mimic a distress call that certain animals instinctively react to. It's part of a larger set of non-lethal deterrents we were trained in. We learned to read animal body language, anticipate their moves, and communicate with them in ways that didn't involve aggression, but rather assertion. Ethan was listening intently, his usual cynicism replaced by genuine fascination. So you were like a real-life animal whisperer? David smiled. More like an animal interpreter. It's about understanding their world, their instincts. It's a lot of patience, a lot of observation, and a lot of respect for the power of nature. He paused, then added, it's also why I know so much about knots and first aid and how to navigate by the stars, all practical skills for surviving in the wild. You never told me any of this, Ethan said, his voice tinged with a familiar note of hurt. Why keep it a secret? David sighed, looking into the flames. It's complicated, Ethan. When I met your mom, I was ready for a different life. The work was consuming. It was dangerous. I'd seen things that change you. I wanted stability. I wanted to build a family, a home. I wanted to be a normal dad with a normal job. I thought that part of my life was over, that I could just put it away. But you couldn't, could you? Ethan asked, his gaze surprisingly perceptive. No, David admitted. Some things become part of who you are, and sometimes life throws you a curveball that forces you to remember, like last night. He looked at Ethan. I also didn't want you to worry, or to think I was some kind of action hero. I just wanted to be your dad. But you are an action hero, Dad, Ethan exclaimed, a genuine laugh escaping him. That was insane. I thought we were going to be bear food. David chuckled. Well, I'm glad we weren't, and I'm glad you're okay. He paused. Then his voice softened. Ethan, about what you said last night, about the bears finishing me off. Ethan's face immediately clouded, the brief moment of lightness vanishing. He looked down at his mug. I didn't mean it, Dad. I was just angry and stupid. I know you were angry, David said gently, and I know you didn't mean it. But those words, they hurt, son. A lot. Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know. I'm sorry. I feel like everything's falling apart. Mom's gone, you're always working, and I don't know where I fit anymore. His voice cracked, and he finally looked up, his eyes glistening. I miss how things used to be. I miss us. David's heart ached. This was the raw, vulnerable truth he'd been longing for. He reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I miss it too, son. More than you know. And you're right. Things have changed, but that doesn't mean we're falling apart. It means we have to figure out a new way forward. Together. But how? Ethan asked, his voice small. You're always so busy, and I feel like I'm just in the way. You are never in the way, Ethan, David said firmly. Never. My job is important, yes, but you are my priority. Always. And if I haven't shown you that enough, then I'm truly sorry. I'll do better. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder. This trip, it was supposed to be a start, a way for us to reconnect. I know it started rough, but maybe it's not too late. Ethan looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. So, you're not going to just go back to being the busy dad when we get home? No, David promised. I'm going to make changes. Real changes, and I want you to hold me accountable. If you feel like I'm slipping, you tell me, okay? Ethan nodded, a small, genuine smile finally appearing. Okay. They spent the rest of the morning breaking down camp, but this time it was different. There was a quiet camaraderie between them. David showed Ethan how to properly coil the ropes, how to pack the tent efficiently, sharing small tips and tricks from his past life. Ethan listened, asked questions, and even offered to help, something he hadn't done in months. As they packed the last of their gear into the car, David felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. The air still held a hint of the wild, but the tension that had suffocated them was gone, replaced by a fragile but real connection. So, Dad, Ethan said as they drove out of the campsite, the towering sequoias slowly receding in the rearview mirror, what else did you learn in this specialized unit? David chuckled. Well, I learned how to track almost anything. how to build a shelter with nothing but what the forest provides, how to purify water, how to identify edible plants and dangerous ones, and how to stay calm when everything around you is chaos. Could you teach me some of that? Ethan asked, his voice hesitant but hopeful. David looked at his son, a warmth spreading through his chest. I'd love to, Ethan. I'd love to. The drive home was filled with conversation, not just about the camping trip, but about everything. Ethan talked about school, about his friends, about his worries. David talked about his job, about the challenges he faced, about his own hopes and fears. They talked about Sarah, about the divorce, about the pain, but this time it was with a sense of shared understanding, not blame. As they approached the city limits, the familiar sprawl of houses and traffic replacing the endless trees, David felt a pang of apprehension. Would this newfound connection last? Would the pressures of their daily lives erode the fragile bridge they had built? But then he looked at Ethan, who was humming along to a song on the radio, a relaxed smile on his face. He seemed lighter, happier, and David knew deep down that this was a start, a real start. The revelation of his past, the secret he had guarded for so long, had been a risk. It had exposed a vulnerability, a part of himself he thought was long buried, but it had also opened a door, a pathway to understanding and connection with his son that he hadn't thought possible. He pulled into their driveway, the familiar suburban house, looking both welcoming and daunting. As they began to unload the car, Ethan paused, looking at David. You know, Dad, Ethan said, a thoughtful expression on his face. When I said that thing about the bears, I was really angry, and I said it because I wanted to hurt you. But now, I'm kind of glad it happened. David raised an eyebrow. Glad? Yeah, Ethan nodded. Because if it hadn't, I wouldn't have seen that, and I wouldn't have known. And we wouldn't be talking like this. He gestured between them. It's like the bear showed me who you really are, and it's actually pretty cool. David felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and pulled Ethan into a hug, a real tight hug, something they hadn't shared in years. Ethan hugged him back just as tightly. I love you, son, David murmured into Ethan's hair. Love you too, Dad, Ethan replied, his voice muffled. As they pulled apart, David looked at his son, truly looked at him. The boy who had wished him dead was now looking at him with respect, with affection, with a glimmer of the old bond they once shared. The wilderness had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it had also given them a chance to rebuild, and David knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was just the beginning of their new story. The secret was out, and it had changed everything, not for the worse, but for a chance at something real, something honest, something that could finally heal. Months passed, and the echoes of the Sequoia National Park adventure and the bear encounter resonated in their lives in unexpected ways. The initial fragile connection forged in the wilderness had steadily solidified, transforming the dynamic between David and Ethan. It wasn't a magical fix, but a deliberate, often challenging process of rebuilding. David made good on his promise. He started leaving work earlier, delegating more, and consciously creating space for Ethan. Their evenings, once filled with Ethan's phone screen and David's laptop, now often involved shared activities. They started with simple things, cooking dinner together, watching movies, or just talking about their days. David found himself genuinely listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Ethan, in turn, began to open up. He talked about the pressures of school, the awkwardness of navigating friendships, and even tentatively about his feelings regarding his mother's new relationship. David listened without judgment, offering support and understanding rather than immediate solutions. He realized that what Ethan needed most was a sounding board, a consistent presence, not a fixer. One Saturday morning, David found Ethan in the garage, rummaging through old boxes. What are you looking for, son? Ethan pulled out a dusty, worn backpack. Remember you said you could teach me some of those wilderness skills? I was thinking we could start with something simple, like how to read a map properly or tie some of those knots you mentioned. A warmth spread through David's chest. This was it, the tangible sign that their connection was deepening. Absolutely, David said, picking up an old compass. Let's start with the basics. Navigation is key. They spent hours in the backyard, then in a local park, practicing. David taught Ethan how to orient a map, how to use a compass to find a bearing, and how to identify different types of trees and animal tracks. Ethan, surprisingly, was a quick study, his initial skepticism replaced by genuine enthusiasm. He absorbed the information like a sponge, asking insightful questions that often surprised David. So, if we were tracking something, Dad, Ethan asked one afternoon, pointing at a faint impression in the mud, would this be a deer print or something else? David knelt, examining the print. Good eye, Ethan. See the split in the hoof? That's definitely a deer, but notice how the edges are a little blurred. That tells us it was probably moving at a decent pace. maybe even running. It wasn't just about the skills, it was about the shared experience. These lessons became their new ritual, a quiet, consistent way for them to spend time together, building trust and understanding. David found himself rediscovering a part of himself he thought he'd lost, the patient teacher, the keen observer, the man who felt most at home in the quiet wisdom of the natural world. The secret of David's past remained just that, a secret between them. Ethan never mentioned it to his friends, or even to his mother. It was their unique bond, a shared knowledge that set them apart. It gave Ethan a sense of pride, a feeling that his dad was not just a regular guy, but someone with hidden depths, someone capable of extraordinary things. And for David, it was a constant reminder of the vulnerability he had shown and the trust Ethan had placed in him. One evening, as they were packing for another, shorter camping trip, this time to a state park closer to home, Ethan looked at David, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Dad," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about wanting to be a normal dad and putting your past behind you." David paused, waiting. "I get it now," Ethan continued. "You wanted to protect me and Mom from whatever that life was. But maybe it's okay to be both. To be a normal dad, but also, the guy who can stare down a bear." He grinned. "It actually makes you a better dad, I think, because you're real, all of you." David felt a lump in his throat. Ethan's words were a balm to an old wound, a validation he hadn't realized he desperately needed. He had always seen his past as something to be hidden, a potential burden, but Ethan saw it as a strength, a unique part of his identity. "Thank you, son," David said, his voice a little rough. "That means a lot." The resolution of their conflict wasn't a dramatic, single event, but a gradual unfolding, a quiet healing. The initial shock of Ethan's hurtful words had been the catalyst, forcing David to reveal a truth he had long suppressed. That revelation, in turn, had cracked open the wall between them, allowing for honest communication and a renewed effort to connect. The truth that could either heal or definitively destroy their bond, as the synopsis had hinted, had ultimately led to healing. It wasn't a miraculous cure for all their family's past pains, but it was a powerful step forward. The divorce was still a reality, and life still presented its challenges, but David and Ethan now faced them with a stronger, more authentic connection. Their second camping trip was everything the first one should have been. They hiked. They cooked over an open fire, and they talked easily and openly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no life-threatening encounters, just a father and son rebuilding their relationship, one shared moment at a time. As they sat by the campfire on their last night, the stars a brilliant tapestry above them, Ethan leaned back, a contented sigh escaping him. "This is nice, Dad," he said, his voice soft. "Really nice." David looked at his son, seeing not just the teenager but the young man he was becoming, resilient, thoughtful, and capable of forgiveness. He saw the reflection of their shared journey, the difficult start, the unexpected revelation, and the quiet, profound healing that had followed. "It is, son," David agreed, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He knew that the wilderness had a way of stripping away pretenses, of revealing true selves, and in that process, it had not only saved him from a bear, but it had also, in a far more important way, saved his relationship with his son. The words, "Hope the bears finish you off," had been a curse, but they had inadvertently led to a blessing, a path towards a deeper, more honest connection than either of them had ever imagined. The secret was out, and it had set them free.